The clapping starts early.
Wait till we talk.
Well, thank you. I was going to ask for the applause in a few minutes, but I'll take it whenever and how often you'd like to give it, especially given our extraordinary guests today. I am Mike Gerhardt, and I'm the scholar in residence at the National Constitution Center. Normally I teach constitutional law at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, but I'm thrilled every time I have a chance to visit the center in Philadelphia. And as Jeff Rosen would counsel me to say, and as you, I trust, all know, the Constitution Center is the only institution in America chartered by Congress to disseminate information about the United States Constitution on a nonpartisan basis. You know, we could have said that together. But before we begin, please take a moment to turn off or silence your cell phones, please. And on behalf of the center, I'd like to thank all of our members for joining us today. And for those of you who are not yet a member, please see Rebecca at the membership table in the Kirby lobby, where you can get information on the benefits of membership and how you can join today. Without any further ado, I want to introduce our terrific guest today, James Traub. He is a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine, where he's worked since 1998. He's written extensively about international affairs and especially the United Nations, as well as national politics, urban affairs, and education. And in recent years, he's reported from quite a number of different places. I won't list them all, but including Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Sudan, Congo, Sierra Leone, Georgia, Kosovo, and Haiti. And his weekly column appears on foreignpolicy.com, the website of Foreign Policy Magazine. He also teaches a class on American foreign policy as part of New York University's Sheikh Mohammed Scholarship Program in Abu Dhabi, where I understand he may be headed soon. But today, he's going to discuss his new book on John Quincy Adams' Militant Spirit. He will also be signing copies of the book downstairs in the main lobby afterwards. This is an extraordinary book, and I want to welcome James for spending time with us today. I've read a number of books about Adams, and I will tell you, I think this not only holds up well, it may be the best of all of them. It's extraordinary work, which he has just told me it took about 5 years to write. And there are very few lives in American politics as rich as John Quincy Adams. It starts early, so perhaps a good place, James, we could begin is with his early political education at, so to speak, his father's knee.
Well, thank you so much, and I'm so delighted to be here and talking about my favorite subject. So his education was not only at his father's knee, but at his mother's knee. So, of course, you all know that he had these extraordinary parents, John and Abigail. And John Adams was away much of the time. So John Quincy Adams is born in 1767. His father starts attending the Continental Congress when the boy is 6 or 7 years old. So much of the time, his education from that age until he's about 11, when he goes with his father to Europe, is at the hands of Abigail. But John Adams is writing constantly. And you realize, reading these letters, that unlike our own kind of Dr. Spock sense today that children basically are designed to work out well and the most important thing is don't get in the way of nature, nobody thought that way then. I mean, there was some certainly remaining Puritan sense of human nature as being wicked, though I don't really think of John and Abigail as being Puritans, but they had some of that. But certainly they didn't have a kind of Rousseauian sense that, you know, children are just children of nature and should be allowed to flourish. Not at all. Everything had to be inculcated correctly, both a moral education and a literary education. Beyond that, here they were at this incredible turbulent moment when these colonies were fighting for independence. So whatever the education would have been anyway, the sense that immense historical and moral forces are at work here made everything more powerful. And the father was writing these letters from Philadelphia saying Benjamin Franklin said this and George Washington said that. And of course, the children, John Quincy and his older sister and younger brothers, one imagines them sitting around the mother's feet at the hearthside hearing this incredible news. So that's part of the surround of the whole thing. So Abigail's in charge of his education, but writes about it to John, so we know a lot about it. So for example, when he's 7 years old, she has him read from a book of history by a guy named Charles Rollins. It was a book that everybody, but adults, read about ancient history. And there were these deeply moralized tales that would tell you about the fall of tyrannical empires from the ancient Greeks and up through the late classical era. And he would read to her a few pages from that. He had a tutor who was his father's now unemployed law clerk, the father being in Philadelphia, who would teach him French. The father would occasionally write and give him Latin verbs to construe and say, when I come home, I want to make sure you can construe them correctly. The father was a very self-educated person. He was the first one who'd gone to college in his family. And by dint of incredible self-discipline and real conscientiousness and care, he had made himself a highly educated person. And he didn't think that it would happen unless he did. So he read that. He read the Latin writers. He read the Latin historians. He read the English poets, and he read a great deal in the Bible. It was an education that, as I say, was a place where Christian belief, Roman example, and patriotic calling were all fused in a very intense way.
And his father took him on trips as well, and eventually brought him into his administration. So tell us a little bit about that.
So here's the interesting thing, that he almost never had both of his parents at the same time. So his education as a little boy, 6 to 10 or 11, is Abigail. His education 11 to 17 is his father, because what happens is John Adams is sent to France in the midst of the Revolutionary War, first in 1779 and then again in 1778, and then again in 1780. So he goes for a few months, it doesn't work out, he comes back, and then they send him there again. And he brings his eldest son, John Quincy, with him. The second time he brings the second son as well. And so John Quincy Adams' second education is a European education. And it's an education with his father. And so now it's his father who's talking to him all the time, and directly he's often there with him, but sometimes he's not. The father deposits him. The father goes to Holland to raise money, lives in Amsterdam, deposits him in Leiden. Leiden had one of the greatest universities in the world. He's a 13-year-old boy, and he's enrolled in Leiden University. He's getting private tutoring in Latin and Greek, but the father's writing him letters saying, all right, tell me who are the great professors at Leiden? Who do they have in philosophy? Who do they have in chemistry? Who's in metaphysics? What are they talking about? And this 13-year-old boy is going to these places and learning these things and basically writing back to his father, can I buy a pair of skates? And the father's saying, yes, but tell me more. So he really grows up very quickly. His education is an adult education very, very early on, and it's a European education. He knows Europe, I would guess, as well as or better than any young man or woman of his generation from the United States.
And so when John Adams Sr. becomes President of the United States, he, of course, has got a remarkable young son he's going to bring into the administration. So how does John Quincy Adams help his father?
Well, John Quincy Adams was unbelievably sensitive about the idea that his father might help him. Classic situation of the young man who does not want to be overshadowed by his father. And so he initially, at age 27, is appointed by President George Washington to go to the Netherlands as ambassador, something he hadn't expected at all. And the father writes to him and says, I know what you think. I know you think, because John Adams was vice president, that I intervened and caused this to happen. You're wrong. Washington thinks you are great. And so he goes to the Netherlands and writes these dispatches, which the proud father shows to George Washington. And George Washington basically comes to view him quite early on as an indispensable source of intelligence on Europe, at a time when the United States had only 4 or 5 diplomats abroad. They were local consuls, but they were commercial positions, not really diplomatic positions. So then, so he remains as a diplomat, and then in 1796, when Washington steps down and John Adams becomes president, John Quincy thinks he's going to go home, and John Adams says, no, I need you. And initially he wants him to go to Lisbon, and then he changes his mind. He's very, very worried about the role that France's attempts to undermine the neutral countries of Northern Europe. And so he sends Adams instead to Prussia, which means Berlin. And he is Adams's real source as Napoleon is beginning to advance, as the military wing, in effect, of the French Revolution sweeps across Europe, declaring republics in various places they've conquered. And as France is posing more and more of a threat to the United States, there's a real fear that ultimately results in something called the quasi-war, a war that didn't happen but came very close to happening. The younger Adams is a very important source of information for the father and helps him decide in the end the United States shouldn't go to war with France.
Well, one thing about the book I think is extraordinary is how you really write each chapter based on a number of years in Adams' life, usually just a few years. We can't replicate that here. Adams' life is too rich for us to cover in 15 minutes if we did it that way. But Adams Sr. Is, of course, pitted against his own vice president in an extraordinary presidential election. It doesn't go Adams' way. So what does John Quincy Adams do after his father leaves the White House?
Well, so at that point, the new president, Jefferson, of course, gets rid of the Adams appointees. John Quincy Adams is delighted to come back, though also worried. He doesn't know what he's going to do. All of his friends who were lawyers like him have gotten rich. Harrison Gray Otis, who's a well-known figure from that time, has a beautiful house that was built by Bulfinch, and he's buying real estate everywhere. So he's very worried about falling behind. And whether for that reason or because he really, really is fascinated by politics, he runs for the state senate of Massachusetts. I should add, by the way, one thing I forgot, is that while in Europe he married Louisa Johnson, who was a woman who was the daughter of an American merchant, wealthy American merchant, and a British woman, so she's actually half British, the first lady, and perhaps I believe the only first lady who was not fully American in terms of citizenship. So he returns with her. They now have a son. He runs for the state senate, and then fairly quickly a position opens up for the U.S. Senate. And he is elected. In those days, it was a state legislature that would elect you, right? They weren't public elections. He's chosen by the state legislature, and he goes to the Senate in 1804.
1804, and of course, who's president of the United States? Not somebody who's a particularly big fan of either Adams. So how does John Quincy Adams work with that president while he's in the Senate?
So Adams and Jefferson have a very complicated relationship. So when Jefferson had first come to Paris in the mid-1780s, his wife had died. He was kind of adopted by the Adams family, very much by Abigail. And here's young John Quincy Adams, at that time 15 years old, 16 years old. And he thinks Thomas Jefferson's the greatest thing he's ever met. I mean, he's so charming, he's so smart, he's so interesting, he's so not an Adams. He's a romantic figure. And he's like his uncle. And I think Jefferson dotes on him, too. So then comes this embittered political rivalry, and the family decides they hate Thomas Jefferson. But Jefferson invites Adams and Louisa to his at-homes, his dinners in the White House. And Adams records these charming evenings where Jefferson says things that are so outrageously untrue, and yet Jefferson seems to have no consciousness of his own love of hyperbole. So he sees through Jefferson in some way, but he also thinks he's fascinating. And Madison will often be there, and Madison's a fascinating person. So in a very barren Washington, this was the social center. But the more interesting thing politically is that this is the moment first of the Louisiana Purchase and then of the run-up to the War of 1812. Mm-hmm. And both of those things disadvantage Adams's own political constituency. The first one because America expands enormously, and suddenly those old eastern seaboard states, which had thought of themselves as the heart of America, were just a small fraction. And so the entire New England delegation opposed the Louisiana Purchase except Adams. Adams says, yes, it's bad for New England, but it's good for America. And he opposed sectionalism, the idea that you would represent a section. You had to represent the whole country. This was a deep thing that he always felt. And so he immediately got his own Federalist Party opposed to him. Then, yet worse, with the British increasingly attacking the American merchant fleet and impressing American sailors into service, Jefferson felt he had to respond. So starting in 1806, he responded by imposing an embargo on British shipping. Well, this was a catastrophe because the embargo went both ways, meaning the United States wasn't going to be exporting to England. Well, that's the New England economy, a very large part of the New England economy. It's a mercantile economy. And so, again, everyone throughout New England was violently opposed to this. This was much worse. This was not a symbolic issue. This was our economy. And Adams didn't really think the embargo would work, but he thought it's the only chance we've got. We cannot let the British insult us this way. And if anything, I would say he was caught between his pragmatic sense that we probably can't do much to stop the British and his fury at the idea that one of these great European powers, America's former colonial master, would treat America in this grossly insulting way by boarding American ships. And so he supported the embargo. And he was told, frankly, by his colleagues, you're going to have your head taken off. That's what someone said to him. And he said, basically, let it happen. And there's this deep strain in the Adams family that comes down from the father, which is if you're being martyred, you know you're doing the right thing. And Adams tried actually to find some way out of it a little bit. Can we moderate this? Can we do this? That. There was no way of skinning the cat in the end. And so by 1808, he has convinced the Federalist Party that he's not a Federalist at all. He's a Jeffersonian. He's a Republican. He's a turncoat. He's a traitor. And they remembered acts of treason they thought that the father had committed. And so, he apes the father. And so he is subjected to the equivalent of a recall. The Massachusetts state legislature nominates a new person to take Adams's place while Adams is still filling the position. And the next day, Adams sends a letter saying, fine, I lay down my job. You can start as of tomorrow. And in many ways, it was a humiliating, mortifying thing. And yet for Adams, nothing made him prouder. And decades later, he said, this was one of the great episodes of my life.
Well, you've already touched on this, although I want to bring it out a little more fully. So, of course, what is also happening during this time period is the death of the Federalist Party. It is dying, in effect, which does give John Quincy some opportunity to think about where he's going to, in a sense, place his future, which party.
Yeah.
So how does he make that decision?
So let us now take a slightly less high-minded view of the same set of affairs and say Adams, unlike a lot of these kind of New England mossbacks, recognizes that, as you said, the Federalist Party is on its last legs. It had been for years, really. And so he does a thing which shocked even his mother, which is he goes to a caucus of the Jeffersonian Republicans in 1808 to decide who to nominate as the next presidential candidate. Now, Adams says he doesn't do this as a party member. He said, I believe all the Federalists were invited. I didn't realize I was the only one who would come. I mean, who knows what he was thinking? So some people thought you're just trying to cultivate them. You want to you want to have a soft landing on the other side. It could be true. It's not really in Adams' nature to do that, though. The kind of suicidal political gesture is more in his nature. So he's told by a number of leading Republicans, look, just kind of let us know that you're on our side and any job will be yours. And Adams looks at them like they're crazy. He would never do a thing like that. He said, of course I won't. He said, I won't do it for anything. You could tell me I'll be president and I won't do it. So he goes home. We're in the summer of 1809, and now Madison is president, and he gets word that Madison wants to appoint him as minister to Russia. Now, is that thanks? Who knows? I mean, Adams was America's most experienced diplomat at that point, and Russia was an enormously important country because it was the leading remaining neutral in the face of Napoleon's attempt to basically subvert all the neutrals. And it was very important that America had a diplomatic presence there, which it did not then have. So that's the next move.
Right. So he and of course, he's remaining true to his nature, which is in some ways sort of trying to be principled, but also a little bit outrageous, cutting his own path, and somehow benefiting from political relationships with people his father detested, and who detested his father. And he's about to take a fairly big step, not just after Madison, but when Monroe becomes president. But I want to get us to the year 1820, which I think is a very critical moment for Adams' future in a number of different ways.
So I'll just quickly jump, I'll quickly build a bridge forward
That's
to
fine.
1820. So he's minister to Russia for 5 years. The War of 1812 comes to an end basically at the end of 1814. He is brought to Ghent in Belgium with the diplomatic delegation to negotiate with the British an end to the war, which he then does. And basically the war is ended on essentially a status quo level where everybody winds up where they were before. So America doesn't have to surrender any property to England. It's not very satisfying, but it's a successful end. He then is made minister to England. And then now is kind of a calm moment. The war is over, and he has a very pleasant couple of years. And then when Monroe succeeds Madison as president, Monroe asks Adams to become his Secretary of State. So Adams now returns to the United States after 7 or so years, 8 years abroad, moves to Washington, goes back to Washington, becomes Secretary of State. And probably the most important thing he did was that the United States was then negotiating with Spain, had been for years, to gain control of what was called the Floridas, because there was Florida and the area immediately to the west, now Arkansas. And so Adams had a protracted and ruthless negotiation with the Spanish minister and the Spanish minister's ally, the French minister, very classically that of a rising power against a falling power. And Adams could not have been more cruel and unsympathetic in asserting the American advantage. And there were many times when his own cabinet members said, okay, we've won a lot, let's just end this. And Adams said, no, I'm not ready. The Spanish would say, look, at least draw a line down the middle of this or that river, and you guys can have this half. And Adams said, no, we want the whole river, whatever it was. And finally, the Spanish say, okay, fine. So Adams not only gets the Floridas, he gets a line, quite literally a line across the country that terminates in what is now Northern California, just below Oregon. And it was the first time the United States had become a continental nation, a dream that all of them had, that Adams very much had. It was one of Adams' proudest moments in life, that he knew that this was the beginning of America's future, its destiny as a continental nation. Okay, so 1820 is important not for a foreign policy reason, but because it's the moment that slavery suddenly becomes an unavoidable subject. And the reason for that is something we all learned about in high school called the Missouri Compromise. And the reason for the Missouri Compromise is that at that time there were 22 states, 11 were free, 11 were slave. Missouri, which was located both on either side of what had been the line between slave and free, applies to come as a slave state, thus imbalancing what had been a balance for quite a while. This occasions a huge debate. Adams is Secretary of State, he can't really be involved in the debate, but he privately fumes. And in a cabinet meeting, and by the way, his cabinet consisted all of slaveholders except himself, he comes out and says, the Declaration of Independence says that all men are created equal. Slavery violates America's deepest principles, whatever the Constitution says. And the others say, this is dangerous doctrine, you shouldn't be talking about this. He has a conversation with John Calhoun, the Secretary of War. Calhoun, of course, later becomes the great ideological supporter, pamphleteer of slavery. And Calhoun says to him, that's really noble, but where I come from, we think those principles only apply to white men. And Adams then goes home and he writes an extraordinary passage in his journal. He kept a diary every day of his life. And he memorialized the conversation. And he said, the more I think about the conversation, the fact that a man like Calhoun can believe things that are so repellent and so obviously false shows how slavery corrupts the slave owner as much as anybody else and corrupts the whole country. And he then writes, he said, I am driven to the conclusion that the bargain created in the Constitution, which was silent on slavery, but which gave the South 3/5 of a person in the census for each slave, was morally vicious and was indefensible. And that was an astonishing conclusion for him to come to, this man who had revered the founders. And it was a tremendous kind of psychological breakthrough, and that would then come to guide his behavior later on in his career.
Right, and so, and of course, we're talking about Adams who's later going to become president, but we're nowhere near the presidency yet.
Yeah.
I mean, we're not quite there yet. This gives us just a little sense of the richness and extraordinary complexity of this person's life. I want to take us now a few years later, because I don't want to lose sight of the subtitle of the book, The Militant Spirit. But this militant spirit is going to have a tremendous impact on the next president, President Monroe, in the fashioning of the most memorable part of the Monroe presidency, which is the Monroe Doctrine. So can you talk about Adams' role in the fashioning of that doctrine?
Yeah, the thing that Adams is probably best known for now is his views of foreign policy. And there's one sentence that came out of a speech he gave. He gave a July 4th address in 1821. He already knew he was going to run for president in 1824. This was Monroe's second term. And he wanted to lay out his principles. And at that time, one of the big raging questions was, what do we do about these countries in South America, pardon me, not countries, colonies of Spain that had now rebelled and had declared themselves, in some cases, republics, emulating the United States. And so some people, and above all Henry Clay, who Adams thought was going to be his chief opponent for the presidency, said America has to basically raise the banner of republicanness and stand at the head of these countries, recognize their independence, champion them as against Spain, and essentially have the kind of a foreign policy driven by America's greatest ideals. Now, Adams, though an intensely moralistic person and an intensely patriotic person, also had a deeply prudent sense of the limits of what was possible for what was still a very weak country. And he was also extremely aware, as rash people like Clay were not, that there could be unthought out consequences to our acts, including acts that seem very noble to us. And so he had always cautioned against rash action. Way back in the 1790s, when war with France impended, he was very concerned that people were being reckless. And even before then, when there were hostilities with England, he was very worried about that. And he always would write, he would say, if resentment were the best guide to our policy, nobody would be more forward than I, because nobody was more resentful at times. But he said it's not. He said it's not. Prudence is the best guide. And this was a very interesting thing about Adams, because in some ways Adams seems incredibly imprudent. He seems like a rash, reckless, militant, vehement person. But because he really was intellectually gifted, his policies were not just an expression of his temperament. They were an expression of a genuine understanding of the world. So, back to 1821, he's giving this speech where he famously says, "We do not go abroad seeking monsters to destroy." Meaning America doesn't look for foreign adventures. America basically defends its own interests according to what is best for America. And so whatever he thought Clay was thinking about South America, in effect he was saying, let's leave that to the South Americans. He said, yes, we recognize their independence because we believe that colonialism is bad. We have broken from our colonial master. And in that same speech he talks about colonialism as being inherently unjust. But they're not going to become democracies. They're not going to become republics. He didn't believe that. He didn't say that in the speech. He said it to Clay. In the speech, he says, we are interested spectators of these events happening abroad, but we will only be spectators. We will tend to our own interests. Okay, so that's 1821. That's the marker he sets down. Then comes 1823. Those issues are still alive. Beyond that, there is a real concern that the resurgent monarchic powers of Europe, meaning Bourbon France, an increasingly conservative England, and above all Tsarist Russia, have formed, well, the English didn't stay in this thing called the Holy Alliance, the Austrians under Metternich did, that there was this group of reactionary powers which really were threatening the whole idea of republicanism. And Monroe was eager to say something and decided he would say something in his annual message to Congress. This precipitated a huge debate. What should Monroe say? And so we only have Adams's record of that in his journal. So obviously Adams comes out the winner of all the debates in his journal. So, we don't really know. However, the way the document finally comes out does sound like what Adams says. And so what Adams says is, we have to assert, here everybody agrees, we have to assert that the United States is, not only the United States, the Americas, because now these countries are really on the verge of independence, that we occupy a sphere of our own, and it is not for Europe to have any further colonies here, and it is not for Europe to attempt to reverse the events that have led to the freedom of all these countries. At the same time, he says, we will not meddle in your business. That's very much what he had said in 1821. Now, I think Monroe would have said the same thing. I think Adams kind of added a certain element of astringency to that. It's not our business. What happens in Europe is your business. You have to recognize what happens in the Americas is ours. Monroe was still very eager to speak up for what he considers to be idealistic American principles of foreign policy, to defend Spain, I think, and Portugal as well, against which were budding republics, against these tyrannical powers. Adams said, no, they're going to see that as a form of interventionism on our part, and that is just going to encourage them to intervene here. Don't do that. And Monroe finally said, okay, he soft-pedaled it. There was a war going on between Greece and Turkey. Many Americans wanted to come to the aid of the Greeks. It was Greece, the birthplace of democracy, and they were Christians. And of course, the Turks were Turks. They were Muslims. And this was a huge raging issue. It was like the CNN war of 1823. So many people read about the monstrosities being perpetrated by the Greeks, and they were being perpetrated against the Greeks, and they wanted to do something. And Adams said, no. And again, Monroe said, in effect, we are interested spectators of what is going on abroad. But that's all he said. And so that doctrine, which today basically means South America was America's sphere of influence, but was a broader statement about America's, on the one hand, its new power. We have the right to tell Europe, keep away. And at the same time, a certain kind of a prudence, which would say what happens in the rest of the world matters to us, but we're not going to do anything about it. We recognize that it's not our business.
So by 1824, John Quincy Adams has had an extraordinary life. He's already had a great impact on America, the United States. He's also got an extraordinary resume. He's on the path of at least being considered for the presidency. 1824, as we all know, is going to turn out to be one of the most extraordinary elections in our history. There are a lot of extraordinary people in and around 1824, many of whom are interested in the presidency. What happens in 1824?
Well, so in those days, if you were Secretary of State, then you were supposed to become president next. Jefferson had, Madison had, Monroe had, all of his predecessors had. And so Adams, it was, from Adams's point of view, he earned it. He had this great career, he checked all the boxes, he was a noble person, he should be president. But at the same time, he wasn't going to run for president. In those days, you stood for office. You didn't run for office. It's a very important verbal difference. But Adams took it further than anybody. When his friends would come and say, okay, we're going to go and talk to possible allies, or we're going to go bribe an editor or something, and he would say, no, you can't do anything. And so Adams is standing for office, but actually not campaigning in any way at all. He's running against Henry Clay. He's running against Andrew Jackson. He's running against a man named William Crawford, who was also a member of the cabinet. And he's running against John Calhoun. And so what finally happens is there is an election in which there's no winner. Jackson wins the most electoral votes. Jackson wins the most popular votes. Adams comes in second and only wins in the very few places where he actually ultimately allowed people to campaign. Crawford comes in third. Clay comes in fourth. Now, according to the Constitution, then and now, if no one wins a majority, the election is thrown into the House. The top three finishers go into the House, and then an election is held in which each state has one vote. So New York, the biggest state, has no more power than Rhode Island, the little state. In those cases also, there were new western states that only had one representative, Indiana, Illinois. And so the jockeying is who is going to get the vote of each state delegation. And it's widely assumed that Jackson's going to win, but nobody can really tell. And so this jockeying starts. And Adams has now forgotten about his resolve to be above the whole thing, you know. And he writes this great passage where he says, who can hold a fire in his hand by thinking of the frosty Caucasus, which is something Richard II says in the Shakespeare play, meaning his ambition. He can try to not be ambitious, but he can't. The ambition is burning in him. And so he reaches this deal with Henry Clay. Henry Clay would have supported Adams in any case. Henry Clay despised Jackson. They hated each other. But I don't think Clay would have done anything. He just would have said, I'm supporting you. He reaches some understanding. We do not know its exact nature because neither man reveals it explicitly. But it is understood that Henry Clay is going to have an important role in the Adams administration if Adams is elected, and that clearly means Secretary of State. And so Clay then persuades his own Kentucky delegation, which was totally anti-Adams, totally pro-Jackson, to vote for Adams. So even though back home in Kentucky, the state legislature just registers its point of view, which is we're all for Jackson, in Washington, the actual caucus of the state, the delegation of the state, votes 8-4. They have 12 representatives for Adams. And probably Clay helped him as well with some of the western states, with Ohio and perhaps Illinois. And so in the end, there's this incredibly dramatic moment that has never happened before. It's February 9th, 1825. The snow is falling. The galleries are packed. And they poll each state one by one. And each state puts their ballot into the ballot box. The boxes are carried up to the front. Daniel Webster's counting one box. An anti-Adams guy is counting another. And Adams speaks first and says, and he reads it out, and he says, the first thing he says is, Mr. Adams has 13. There were 24 states then. And of course, everybody goes nuts. It means he's won. So he does win. He's thrilled. He's excited. He then gets inaugurated, and he says, Henry Clay is my Secretary of State. Well, what is that? What is that? That's John Quincy Adams has engaged in low, scandalous bargaining? So Andrew Jackson calls this the corrupt bargain. I mean, before Andrew Jackson has gotten home to Tennessee, the word corrupt bargain has spread everywhere. And for the next 4 years, Andrew Jackson and his allies and the many, many newspapers in his corner can speak of nothing except for the corrupt bargain. They attack Clay even more than Adams, because Clay was whiskey-drinking, poker-playing. He was easy to attack for corruption. But nevertheless, Adams was illegitimate, and he was an illegitimate president, and he labored under that burden for all 4 years.
Now, before we launch into the presidency, which is going to turn out pretty much as we might expect it to turn out, tell us how many votes did Adams get in Kentucky?
Yes, thank you for reminding me of that. So in the state of Kentucky, Adams received 0 votes. 0. That's how corrupt the bargain was.
Right. Which, by the way, you point out in the book isn't a true charge, but sometimes truth doesn't have much to do with anything. It seems to fit the characters.
Let's just say this. If somebody had done this to Adams, he would not have abided. He would have said this is a gross violation of all the principles that we hold dear.
And of course, Jackson is going to make the most out of this. And he wasted little time to make the most out of this while Adams is trying to put together an administration. How is Adams able to put together an administration, besides just getting Clay in as Secretary of State, given the path by which he arrives at the presidency?
Well, first, Adams' inclination was just to keep all the people who were already there. I mean, he thought it wasn't right to have your own people. But in the end, he did. And he tried to get people from different parts of the country. He did try to assemble something of a diverse cast. And he actually had a good cabinet. I think that wasn't his problem. His problem was that first he gained office under this evil star. But then you would think if you were in that situation, you would go to enormous lengths to seduce, bribe, charm, work with all those people who were opposed to you, and to really gather your own allies around you. Adams never occurred to him to do that. It was against his nature to do that. Adams thought, I will say the right thing, I will speak the truth, and if people don't regard it, that's not my problem. And so he then lays out an astonishingly ambitious agenda. an activist government agenda. We would now say a very left of center agenda. He wants to build roads and canals and bridges. He wants to build a national university. He wants to do scientific exploration. He wants to build astronomical observatories. He wants to create a new home ministry in the government, and it collapses. It utterly collapses. Nothing of this is achieved. And Clay tells him, don't propose stuff that you can't enact. And Adams says, maybe it's for a future generation, not for me. Which it was. I mean, in the end, Abraham Lincoln enacted some of these things many, many years later.
And who is his vice president?
Adams' vice president is John Calhoun.
And how do they get along?
About like the way John Adams got along with Thomas Jefferson, badly. And so Calhoun, within a year or two, Calhoun is actively scheming against Adams with Jackson. I mean, they're having meetings, probably secret meetings at Calhoun's house in order to figure out how to organize the opposition to Adams, which he does very effectively.
But at the same time, I don't know that one would call it a friendship, but at least a fairly good working relationship develops between two people that one might not have expected such a relationship to exist between, and that's between Adams and Clay.
Yes. Yeah.
Does Adams develop a begrudging respect for Clay, or at least they develop a
both.
working relationship?
I would say both do. Clay was really surprised. Clay thought this is going to be agony, because Clay just thought he was the biggest buzzkill he ever met in his life. He really did. Adams was waking up when Clay was going to sleep. But he saw that Adams was a person he knew how intelligent he was, but his integrity, his honesty, and his openness to Clay. So Adams didn't at all second-guess Clay as Secretary of State. Adams actually gave Clay at least as much of his own head as Monroe had to Adams. And Clay really came to admire him a great deal. And Adams utterly depended on Clay. I mean, Clay was a man who knew men. Adams didn't know men. He knew stuff in his head. And so Clay became his indispensable advisor.
And in fact, Adams really didn't like the kind of activity we associate with politics, which is shaking hands, meeting with people, sort of getting along with people.
He couldn't do it.
This does not happen during his administration.
He couldn't.
He
absolutely couldn't do it.
So one of the questions from the audience is, given the brilliance of Adams, why couldn't he use his amazing intellect to be a more successful president?
That puts too much stress on the importance of brilliance. I mean, you think about that famous comment Churchill was alleged to have made about FDR, a first-class temperament with a second-class intellect. Adams had a first-class intellect with like a third-class temperament. So, and you think about people like Jimmy Carter, Wilson, some of our most intellectually gifted presidents, if they didn't have the temperament for politics, which is a kind of suppleness, it doesn't mean Machiavellian cynicism, but it means suppleness. That's why Henry Clay was so interesting a figure. LBJ is our classic version, but Clinton is a good version. He didn't have that, and that's why he was so unsuccessful.
And he realizes pretty quickly he's not going to be successful. He realizes, I think, pretty quickly he's going to be a one-term president.
Yeah. I wonder, there's some part of me that thinks he didn't so much want to be president as feel like if he wasn't president, it would have been an unspeakable humiliation. So he had to be president. And so once he got to be president, he didn't really think, how can I maximize this opportunity and make myself the most effective president I could be? I've seen James Monroe. I can learn from his mistakes. If he ever thought that, God knows he never says it in his journal or ever does anything that shows he thinks that.
And what would Adams have regarded as his greatest achievement as president?
That's a very interesting question. I honestly don't know. I mean, I really don't know. I think that it probably would have had to do with something kind of tedious sounding like tariffs, like the creation of a tariff regime that was able to increase revenue for the administration. But even that tariff regime collapses at the end of his tenure in the abominable tariff of 1828. Adams writes very little about his own successes, and his own successes are relatively modest. I mean, they're quite modest.
So where does Adams go after he leaves the presidency?
So he goes home, he returns to Quincy, he tends his garden the way his father did, He assumes this is it. And then some gentlemen come along and say, we need you to run for Congress in the 8th Congressional District. We're worried we might not win. And Adams says, well, if it's going to be contested, it would be beneath my dignity. But if I can have it without running for it, then yes, I'll do it. And they say, done. And so in 1831, he's elected to Congress, something that had never crossed the mind. I mean, his father spent 26 years puttering in the garden. Never occurred to him to run for Congress. John Quincy Adams, this is the militant spirit part, he couldn't live without it. He could not live, for all that he hated politics in the sense that you've said, compromise, for him, politics was the sphere in which the great issues of justice were worked out. That's what politics meant to him. And he could not live without the fight over that. And so he very happily returned to Washington.
So what fights does he then pick in Congress?
Well, there's a whole bunch that we could talk about, but I want to really focus on one, because honestly, I wouldn't have written the book without it. So he doesn't have a purpose in going back, and he does this, that, and the other thing. Then, in 1835, the anti-slavery movement in the United States begins in earnest. And one of the things that happens is anti-slavery activists begin to submit petitions to Congress. And those petitions will call for Congress to do something against slavery, usually to end slavery in the District of Columbia, over which Congress has jurisdiction, or to end the slave trade between the states. Because they couldn't call for an end to slavery because the slavery itself was a state-by-state question. It wasn't a federal question. So most congressmen wouldn't submit these petitions because they knew the South would hate it. Adams, fine, he'll submit them. And so this became a huge drama because the South didn't want this to be debated. The South took the position, this is a question for the states. It is not a suitable question for the Congress. You cannot have a discussion about slavery. Adams said, the Constitution guarantees the right to petition. How can you abridge that? And so the South then responded, and remember, the South is overrepresented because of the 3/5 clause. And for that reason, the North tends to be quite timorous in these matters because they're aware of their own weakness. So the South responds with what's called the gag rule, which in many different forms essentially said that petitions about slavery, and only about slavery, cannot be presented to Congress. And each time they would win the vote, and that was the end. And then Adams would begin like a kind of buzzing mosquito to find some way of presenting a petition that he could claim wasn't really exactly about slavery, so wasn't really covered by the gag order. And this got more and more bitter. And Adams was, at this point, aflame with righteous fury. And really, in a way, I think it was the heroism and the martyrdom he'd always sought. In a great cause, because remember, 1820, he had come to conclude that slavery was an evil, and now the moment had come for him to do something about it. And so the first time this came to a head in 1837, the South finally lost all of its patience with the former President of the United States and moved to censure him. And Adams essentially stood up alone, and nobody would come to his side. The North was really afraid of the South, and he annihilated them. He basically held the floor for weeks, and he destroyed every argument, and by the end, the pro-censure folks got 28 votes out of 200 some odd. And Adams, of course, was thrilled. This continues on and on and on and on and on until the great drama concludes in 1842, when Adams once again needles them to the point of just insane fury on purpose, on purpose. Now abolitionism is a big issue, and Adams really wants to win this battle. And so again, there's another censure motion. And now the South is much more sophisticated about it. They appoint their own chief prosecutor, Thomas Marshall of Kentucky, who is the nephew of John Marshall, the great Supreme Court justice, and widely regarded as an eloquent man and a Whig, so on Adams' side politically, so not considered just another anti-government slaveholder. And so then for the next several weeks, this battle takes place again. Now it's a much bigger battle because Adams has abolitionists on his side who were doing research in the Library of Congress. He has other legislators who are prepared to stand with him. So it's a way bigger battle. And Adams makes them beg for mercy. And after 2 weeks, Thomas Marshall realizes he's completely lost control of the process. He's completely overreached. Adams has made him look like a fool. And he calls the question knowing he's going to lose just to bring it to an end. And Adams wins once again. And this is, for the forces of abolition, the first time they have ever truly defeated the South in a major battle. Now, the abolitionists quite wrongly think now slavery has become unsustainable and they're going to be compelled to end their support for it. Adams never thinks that. He knows perfectly well that slavery will only end with a civil war. And so it's a tremendously important moral victory. It's an incredible vindication for Adams. But of course, it does nothing in the end to prevent the race towards the Civil War.
Well, while he's in Congress, Adams, of course, has a chance to work with a number of different presidents. The presidents that follow Adams obviously include Jackson, Van Buren, Harrison, Tyler. What does Adams think of all these different presidents?
Well, there are some he hates more than others.
Which ones? We'll start with the ones he hates
No,
the
the
most.
only one he likes is Harrison, who lasts for a month.
Right.
So his initial view of Harrison is like warmed over Jackson. He's another military hero and a bumpkin and a fool. But Harrison was a very gracious man who came to Adams's home in Washington before he was inaugurated and said, "I will always depend upon you for advice," and was really sweet to Adams's granddaughters. And Abigail said, "He's a nice guy." And so I think there was a brief moment when Adams thought, finally my agenda, my activist government agenda, the Whig agenda can be enacted. And then, of course, Harrison dies. And he's replaced by Tyler. Now, Tyler was a Whig in name only, as we would say today of Republicans in name only. He was a Southerner, he was a Jeffersonian, but he was not a man of any intellectual gifts. He was a slaveholder. Adams thought of the worst kind. Adams despised Taylor, despised him, and just felt like all of his hopes for a different kind of union had been dashed with Tyler's nomination. And so that, for him, was really the great catastrophe. And then after 1844, by that time, he's an old man. It doesn't really matter as much. But he continues to fight, for example, he thought that the Mexican-American War was a huge mistake because he thought that Texas was really all about slavery, that the Texans wanted to bring in a slave state, and it would be like the Louisiana Purchase in size, only all slave. And so, in fact, Adams dies at age 80 in 1848 on the floor of the House in the midst of a roll call on a vote for giving pensions to veterans of the war, which, I mean, everybody's in favor of pensions for veterans, except Adams, because the war was evil. And so he probably was, pulsing inside, like with fury, the way he always did, and then he had an enormous stroke and he toppled over. And he's then carried off the floor of the House into the office of the Speaker and laid upon a couch there. And I have never confirmed what I have been told, that that couch now sits in the office of Supreme Court Justice John Roberts. I really need to find out if that's true or not. And because obviously that would give me some pretext to visit Roberts' chambers. So he lies there for 2 days between life and death, and then he dies.
Of course, the incredible question has to be, what does Chief Justice Roberts use that sofa for?
And obviously, I don't know the answer.
Anybody
America wants to know.
Sit there, please. Yeah. Well, Adams, of course, didn't suffer fools gladly. He was critical of so many different people, worked with so many different presidents. Who, if anyone, did he look up to throughout all this incredible political life?
That's a very interesting question. And there's a very small... okay. No, here's the kind of a fair answer. Adams had a profound reverence for his father's generation. He had a profound reverence for his father and mother. He thought about them as more than human. I mean, his mother did a lot of harsh things, and there's some books about Adams that kind of make her out to be the cause of his cramped, bearish, unhappy life. Maybe it is so. He didn't think so. He adored her, and when she died, he was bereft. His father, he worshipped. If there was any man he worshipped beyond his father, it was George Washington. He named his first child not John, but George. And that was a bad move in the family. And Abigail writes and said, at least if you had said George John, it would have been okay. But in fact, his name was George Washington Adams. So he now in his home, someone, I think William Seward perhaps, somebody reports on the paintings he had up on the wall. One of Washington, one of his father, and interestingly, one of Jefferson. I don't know quite why, but he did. But he, I have a whole litany of his terrible things he says about Jefferson. So I would say probably for him, George, and then if you go back in time, Cicero. Cicero was his beaming light.
And he had been a professor of rhetoric.
And as a professor of rhetoric, to him, Cicero was the figure of all figures, the great rhetorician, but also the man of justice and the great patriot. The patriot who, in the end, is martyred. He's basically he's killed by the emperor's mobs because he refuses to knuckle under.
Which, of course, would have explained Adams' admiration for him.
Right, exactly.
Right. So Adams, of course, exasperated lots of people. Let's go back to Louisa, his wife, and we have a question about Louisa, which is tell us a little bit more about her, and the question actually includes the comment that that the writer understands there's going to be a new biography coming out about Louisa.
So there is what I suspect is a very good book, written oddly enough by a woman named Louisa. Louisa Thomas has written a biography of Louisa Adams, and I urge you all to buy that right after you buy my book. So the sad thing about Adams he was a bad husband and he was a bad father. There's no way around that. And the only moments when I wasn't sure I could keep writing this book were moments when I was reading things that Louisa said that were so painful that I just thought, how can this man have behaved this way? So Adams grew up with the most extraordinary parents. I mean, how many marriages like that could there have been in America then? And he saw how much respect his father had for his mother. And so you would have thought that he would have almost intuitively repeated that, but he didn't. Not at all. It wasn't that he was, a wife beater or something. I mean, he loved Louisa, but he didn't treat her with anything like the regard his father treated Abigail with. He never asked her opinion about anything. He never told her anything that he was doing politically. He never treated her as any kind of equal partner. In life, yes, but not certainly in his public life. He could be as harsh and as judgmental to her as he was to everybody. She suffered a great deal. She was a very sprightly young woman, if a kind of a hothouse creature when he met her. And life really ground her down. Now, it's not John Adams' fault that she had 9 or 10 miscarriages. It's not John Quincy Adams' fault that her beloved infant named Louisa died at the age of 1. I mean, these were horrible things that happened. But it is his fault, I think, that he did not give her the sense of, no matter what happens, I love you and I consider you to be my equal partner in life. Her time in the White House was terrible, just depression and loneliness. And she wrote a lot. She wrote a lot of fiction. She wrote poetry. She wrote plays for herself. She wouldn't let anybody see them. We've seen them now. She wrote a play, which is an obvious thin veil over the reality of the White House. And she only wrote the first scene, which is a kind of procession of characters. And the main character is named Lord Sharpley. And Lord Sharpley is obviously John Quincy Adams. And he is a figure of irreproachable integrity, but barely even human. He's frighteningly judgmental and sure of himself and public-spirited, but devoid of good human impulses. It makes you feel ill to read it.
Well, we don't have much time left. In fact, we only have time for one more question. The question I've got from the audience is, are there any useful implications that we could apply from his life or his experiences to our current political life?
Of course I get asked this a lot, and I'm reluctant to make this kind of one-to-one connection. The one thing that I so admire about him is what John F. Kennedy called his political courage, his willingness to defy his own constituents and his own political party to do what he thought was right. Now, the fact is, that can often be a form of suicide, as it was in his case. And I would not wish to have a president who was as principled as he was. And yet, the thing that's kind of so extraordinary to me is that the same quality that in the end made him fail as a president and made him so isolated and lonely and made him seem like he was a throwback and really made America look upon him as some ancient figure, in the end brought him back to public admiration and even reverence because of this struggle over slavery, which everybody could see he did by himself, out of principle, despite all the odds, in an act of incredible fearlessness. And at the very end of his life, this man who had been treated as a relic of the past, of that old New England past, was revered as the last living link to the Founding Fathers. And so he didn't do it for that reason. He never tried to do that. He was never interested in cultivating public opinion. And yet, purely by virtue of that courage, he gained this second look from the public and was seen for the man that he was.
There is a lot more we could talk about. James is going to be here available to answer other questions as he signs books in the lobby. Believe me, we could have spent a lot of time talking about any one of the jobs John Quincy Adams had. A man who could have so many jobs and have the life he led could only be the subject of an extraordinary book. It is an extraordinary book. Let me thank our extraordinary guests.
Thank you so much. Thank you all.